Okay. All right. Turn off a couple lights here. All right, so pull up the notes that I sent out this morning here. Make sure we got that on Google Classroom. So, like I said, I'm going to combine chapters 3 and 4 into a test. So when we get closer to the test, I'll let you guys know when we're going to do that. All right. So and again, if you haven't taken the chapter 2 test, you can still take it. All right, those of you guys who haven't taken it, you can still take it. Make sure you get into me as soon as possible. Because right now, if you haven't taken it, it's marked as a 0. All right, so you gotta take it. All right, if you haven't taken it yet. So chapter 3, like I said, is kind of just basically, it's not a very creative title. It's the United States Constitution here, but what chapter 3 is a little touch upon a little bit like we talked about in chapter 2, some aspects. All right, we're talking about like kind of yesterday when I was talking about the introduction of the ideals. We talked about some historical kind of documents that are going to influence the kind of those who are writing the Constitution and the convention there that we talked about in Philadelphia in 1787. Again, this doesn't just happen overnight. All right, there's certain things that have, again, a lot of it harks back to kind of British tradition or English tradition. Things like the Mayflower Compact. All right. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut and stuff like that. So this is, again, there's an emphasis on kind of written, kind of like a constitution is basically kind of a written plan, all right, laying out how things are going to go down, all right, again, kind of establishing kind of parameters, if you will, all right. And so one of the aspects that kind of like is laid out in the foundation here of the Constitution is this concept of kind of branches of government and such. All right, and we'll talk about each of them specifically as we get into certain chapters, if you will. But again, also to remember, we were talking like the U.S. Constitution as we have right now was not the first form of government that we had. The first form of government, as we know, is called the Articles of Confederation. There was a little bit of more of it. If you had to say who had a little bit more power, you'd probably argue the states with that. All right, so while we're kind of creating this new Constitution, creating that system called federalism, where you're basically kind of sharing power with a national government, and then a kind of the multiple state governments. There's an emphasis on trying to make sure that the national government, what we call the federal government, right, isn't too powerful. All right, and so there's this thing that's kind of like a kind of a theme, and next week we're gonna do like kind of a DBQ. We're gonna do the first part of it together, kind of talking about this, but in this idea, like James Madison said, the framers were kind of concerned about concentration of power into like hands of, let's say, one person. All right, and this concept of tyranny, and tyranny is basically kind of a cruel, oppressive government rule or power here. All right, this kind of comes from this term like tyrants, which is kind of a term that kind of originated in Greece. That meant some, as time went over time, it kind of changes into like some of like a tyrannical kind of type of government would be one where you have a dictator. All right, and so this idea, like kind of coming out of that tradition where England, Great Britain. And kind of like the concept of a monarchy and the founders kind of identifying that as tyranny. The Constitution puts things in place to try to prevent something from happening like this. Now, just in the news, this last month, it's been tested, all right, to say the least. Like, the founding fathers probably were trying to put something in there to prevent what had happened on January 6th. All right, the elephant in the room, basically, this idea of basically somebody like kind of storming and kind of overthrowing the government. So we try to kind of put these kind of like stopgaps into that. Come on in. Thank you very much. So on Tuesday, when we come back on Tuesday, and then those of you guys will be on remote here, when we check into Google Meet, we're gonna do a DBQ that talks about how like the kind of Constitution kind of like addresses this issue here. All right. And so some of the things we'll touch upon, like here, for example, this whole idea of separation of powers. All right. This is a kind of direct response to trying to prevent kind of a tyrannical government. All right. Not just one person, but just like kind of government in general here. So separation of powers, in the sense here, is kind of like each branch. And we talk about 3 branches of government here in the federal government. So each of them having a specific duty or responsibility that they are kind of focused on, right? And so this kind of prevents where we kind of lay power into one hands of like one branch of government, all right, which could lead into like one person kind of like basically kind of controlling things. So this is stuff that you guys were probably kind of familiar with just a couple of years ago when you're dealing with the Constitution, all right? So each branch has a specific role that they do. And a lot of times the way to kind of keep it straight, and generally on the Constitution test you'll have, is what each of these branches does when it pertains to laws. Because in the Constitution, kind of laws are the basis for what this is, all right? We have to kind of like what you can and cannot do within a kind of like a civilized kind of society. All right, so like for example, sorry about that. So the first branch of government, and this usually we'll talk here, when the framers of the Constitution left Philadelphia, they left with like in there was articles. They would kind of separate them by articles. All right. So Article 1, if you look at the Constitution, Jimmy, Article 1 is the longest. All right. If you look at it, it goes on pretty extensively. That's on the legislative branch. And still this, and this is where kind of the framers, if you had to say which of the branch initially they kind of gave a little bit more kind of power to, you could probably argue the legislative branch. All right. So the lawmaking body of the legislature is basically the House and Senate, right? We talked about this in that term. What's that term for two-house legislature? What do they call that term? Bicameral, good. All right. So, and we get that concept kind of from the British kind of tradition because they have in Parliament, they have the House of Lords and House of Commons, right? So, and when we get into this is specifically when we get into Chapter 5, we'll get into more specifics on what are the powers of basically the legislative branch, all right, what they can and cannot do and such, all right? So Article 1 just basically states the powers and also the limits that the legislative branch has. But if you look at the Constitution, the physical Constitution, you notice that the legislative branch is the Article 1 is the longest one, all right? Has the most amount of kind of like powers and kind of such, all right? So and when we talk about like when it comes to like kind of like what they do, like the legislative branch, they're the ones who makes the laws, right? They're the ones who kind of like particularly kind of like and we'll talk about specifics of bills and laws and stuff like that. All right. I'm going back up. The Article 2 of the Constitution deals specifically with the executive branch. All right. Now the executive branch, their main job is to carry out or enforce the laws. All right. This we'll get into more detail when we get into Chapter 6. Now, over time, if you look at the Constitution, the Constitution definitely gives more power probably to the legislative branch. Over time, as things go on, the Constitution sometimes is a kind of like ever change, even though it's written, it can sometimes be interpreted to change over time. Over time, we start to see the executive branch assert more power. All right, and that initially wasn't what the framers kind of had intended to. All right, just like if you're noticing, like if you ever follow the news here with President Biden, he's been signing a lot of executive orders. All right, these are something we'll talk about more specifically when we get into Chapter 6. These are kind of actions that have the weight of laws, but they're not kind of passed in the traditional kind of sense in where it goes through the legislative branch. All right, so a lot of stuff that President Biden's been doing, some people who are what they kind of like strict constitutionalists say it's a little bit of kind of asserting a lot, probably a little too much power. All right, and that's a debate with people who are constitutional lawyers and stuff like that. So the kind of, like I said, the legislative branch makes the laws. The executive branch is supposed to enforce the laws, carry them out. All right, we'll talk about that more specifically when we get to Chapter 6. And then the third branch is the judicial branch. All right, this is stated in Article 3. Their job is to interpret the laws, carry out the laws. All right, and we'll talk about and today we'll talk about a little bit how that's changed over time as well. All right, the head of this branch in the federal government is the Supreme Court. We'll deal with this in more detail when we get into Chapter 7. All right, and with that, again, much like the executive branch, kind of the judicial branch's power has kind of changed over time and influence. If you look at the physical kind of Constitution, you notice that this is a pretty short written article. All right, if you're just looking at it, it's much shorter than definitely much shorter than Article 1. All right, and like I said, we'll get into a little bit more detail here. Some of the stuff you look in the Constitution is almost purposely vague as to be kind of interpreted different ways. All right, so each branch has a specific power when it comes to it. All right, to a certain extent, this kind of I just try to kind of prevent tyranny. When we hear this term gridlock, and to a certain cases, a lot of times gridlock occurs in government It's almost kind of like it was designed that way to a certain extent. And so sometimes it kind of like frustrates people. But the founding fathers wanted to make sure that not one of these branches was getting like basically too much power. All right. So that's pretty easy kind of interpret here, if you will. All right. And then there's an emphasis here on also each of these branches making sure that they keep the other one honest, if you will. All right. So there's something kind of laid out within, kind of embedded into the Constitution, this concept of checks and balances here. So I'm going to play this kind of like this crash course on that concept. Now, again, I apologize. These tend to be kind of corny. The dude that narrates them is a little cringy, all right? But I think it does a really good job of kind of explaining things in kind of like charts and details to get kind of a better understanding. But again, I apologize. The guy thinks he's funny. Like, I know the same thing with teachers and adults. We do stuff that basically that's we're just corny, all right? I used to not be so corny. I used to be kind of cool back in the 90s, believe it or not. But as time goes on, you'll get corny one day. All right, and your kids will roll their eyes at you, and like other like teenagers, if you see out at Target or something like that, will roll their eyes at you. So just bear with this guy. It's not his fault. All right, it's just the nature of getting older. I digress.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today I'm going to try to explain two fundamental concepts of American government that students and citizens often confuse: Team Jacob and Team Edward. Separation of powers and checks and balances. Team Jacob. So separation of powers is really simple. The national government is divided into three separate branches: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. I put them in this order because that's the way the Constitution has them, and I'm not going to argue with the Constitution, except for that stupid 3/5 of a person thing. So the legislative branch comes first because it's supposed to be the most important branch. And Article 1 is the longest and most detailed of the 7 articles in the Constitution. The main job of the legislature is to make laws. The secondary job is to say, no, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. I'm going home. I have to campaign. Then we have the executive branch, and here the Constitution is a little less helpful. Article 2, Section 1 states, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. The executive branch is obviously more than just one guy or girl. The executive branch is in charge of executing the laws, which basically means carrying them out. So the president is like the CEO of the U.S., making sure that the government governs. Interestingly, the president's power as executive is found in the oath of office. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Wait, Stan, I just gave the presidential oath of office, so I'm president now, right? Totally. Oh, elections. Yeah, we didn't have those. Last, and in the eyes of many people at least, is the judicial branch. The job of the judiciary, also sometimes called the courts, which I'm going to call the courts because judiciary is really hard to say, is to interpret the law, to explain what it means. Article 3, which describes the courts, is even shorter than Article 2. It has only 3 sections instead of 4, and the courts today don't really look like this description. Here's the first sentence of Article 3, Section 1. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. At least the framers realized that the entire United States would probably need more than one court. But notice right there in the sentence that Congress has the power to create all other courts. And this leads us nicely into the second important concept of American government: checks and balances. Yeah, that was a segue right into it. It was a nice job by me. I'm going to need a little help explaining checks and balances, so let's do that part in the clone zone. Checks and balances is a confusing term because it implies two things, but really it would be better to think of them as checks that balance, although that might be confusing to people who actually try to balance their checkbooks. Anyway, the point here is that each of the branches has the power to limit or check the other two, and this creates a balance between the 3 separate powers. In the same way that the Constitution lays out the legislature in the greatest detail, it also gives the legislature the greatest number of checks on the other branches. Legislative clown? So the framers of the Constitution were really concerned about the president becoming a tyrannical figure a la King George III. That guy was a jerk. So the Constitution gives the legislature a lot of power over the executive. The House of Representatives can impeach the president. Then the Senate can remove the president from office, but only if 2/3 of the senators vote for impeachment. The Senate can also check the president's appointment of judges and officials by rejecting them. This is known as advice and consent. Either branch of Congress can investigate executive activities and officers.
If the president vetoes a law, Congress, with a 2/3 vote in both houses, can override the veto. Congress can also refuse to pass laws that the executive wants, and probably most important, they can refuse to appropriate funds for executive programs. You might think that since the judiciary is the third and presumably least important branch, Congress would have fewer checks on it, but that would be wrong. Here are the ways that the legislative branch can limit the judicial branch. Congress can impeach and remove judges as it can do with the president. Congress can be a bunch of jerks sometimes. That's me. The Senate can reject judicial nominees, which is a check on judges before they even get there. Congress can change the federal court system by adding or taking away courts like it says in Article 3. And it can change the jurisdiction of federal courts. Congress can pass new laws that override Supreme Court decisions, as long as the decisions aren't based on the Constitution. Don't want to do that. No. And as a very last super drastic resort, Congress can propose amendments to the Constitution as it did with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, overruling the Dred Scott decision.
Wow, legislative clone. It looks like the framers were so scared about an all-powerful super president that they gave Congress most of the power. Executive clone? You know what? I'll be executive clone since I'm basically president of the clones. The executive branch can check the legislature in the following ways. The president can veto Congress's laws so that they don't go into effect. The president can call Congress into special session, but he can't make them pass new laws. The executive branch carries out the laws and may do so in ways that are contrary to what Congress wanted. Although this rarely happens, the vice president is given the power to break ties in the Senate, which is one of his only real powers other than embarrassing the president. The president nominates Supreme Court justices, and this can change the way the court works. He also nominates federal court judges, and this shapes the entire court system. The president can pardon people convicted by the courts, which cancels out their judgments. The president can also, in his capacity to carry out the laws, refuse to carry out court decisions. So you can see that even with the number of checks that it has, the executive branch is weaker than the legislature.
But not as weak as the judiciary branch. Many political scientists consider the judiciary the weakest branch because without legislative and executive action, it doesn't have a whole lot to do. Being the weakest branch, the judiciary also has the fewest checks on the other two branches. Here's what it can do. The judiciary checks the legislature by declaring its laws unconstitutional. The Chief Justice presides over impeachment trials, and sometimes he gets to wear a special robe when this happens. Perk of the job. It's a perk of the job. It's really nice. And the judiciary checks the executive branch by declaring executive acts unconstitutional. A really good example of this was Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer. Super important case. Look it up. Look it up. The court also issues warrants in federal crime cases, and again presides over impeachment trials in the Senate. But the big check that the courts have is invalidating laws and executive actions. We'll talk about how courts actually do this and where they got this power in a later episode.
No, I'll talk about it in a later episode. Now, okay? Let's go back to the regular desk.
No, out of order!
Thanks, clowns. Now, some of you are probably saying, Craig, this is very helpful information, but why do we have checks and balances in the first place? To you, I say, stop talking to your computers. That's weird. I also say, let's go to the thought bubble. So the framers of the Constitution were terrified of a tyrannical central government that would destroy people's rights like they felt the British had. The powers of the national government are separated, and each branch is able to check the others because this makes it more difficult for the government to act in ways that harm the rights and interests of the citizens. One of the best explanations of this comes from, you guessed it, the Federalist Papers. In this case, Federalist 51, which was written by James Madison, who also wrote a lot of the Constitution and became president. So he kind of knows what he's talking about. And really, it's a shame that he's not on our money, because then Americans would pay him more attention. They would also pay him, literally. In Federalist 51, the title of which also contains the phrase checks and balances, Madison wrote, "But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" That's right, he wrote with an accent. Don't know how that's possible. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Madison was talking about checks and balances. I'll leave it up to you to decide if human nature requires that we build safeguards into our government to protect us from our leaders. But Madison thought so. And I think so too. But this isn't about me. This is about government. And it's helpful to remember that when people tell you that the framers of the Constitution were infallible, James Madison actually thought that they were outfallible. Or just fallible. Anyway, see you next time. I'm so fallible. Crash course.
All right. So, sorry again. Like the dude's cringe. I get it. But there's some things that are laid out that are kind of important here, kind of, and they kind of show that in some cartoons and diagrams, if you will. So another important kind of concept that's kind of baked into the Constitution here is this concept of checks and balances. That a lot of times that kind of go along with the separation of powers. So this basically kind of the idea is to try to ensure the equal distribution of limits of the branches of government and their kind of power to make sure not one branch kind of gains too much power over the other. Now, this concept actually comes from a French philosopher who was he wrote a book called Spirit of Laws in 1748, not too long before the the Constitution, and this was this advocation for this idea, and this kind of comes out of the Enlightenment that we had talked about. This idea that kind of individuals can kind of steer their own destiny rather than the divine right of kings, if you will. And so again, these are like the framers, particularly Madison, who's kind of advocating for this in Federalist 51, are looking towards other kind of precedent, if you will. All right, and so within this concept of checks and balances, all right, each branch can kind of make sure that the other one is the idea is to kind of keep them honest to a certain extent. All right, so for example, for the executive branch has a check on the legislative branch when it says the president can veto. Right, and that term veto has its origins in the Roman Republic. Right, in the Roman style of kind of governing, their form of executive was called the council. And it was basically two kind of executives. To basically, if one did not want to agree with the other one or felt that the laws that they were kind of implementing were not just or fair, they would issue a veto, which is a Latin term which means I forbid. All right. So that origin even comes from again, the founding fathers were well aware of what we call classical kind of culture, like Roman and Greek and such. Congress could check the president, legislative could check the executive by overriding that veto. All right. So they pass a law, goes to the president's desk. He he basically says, I don't agree with this, vetoes it. It goes back to where it originated, and it has to back both houses by a 2/3 vote. Now, just like President Trump, right before he left office, the only veto that he issued was just a veto he had in December, which was dealing with funding the military, right? And he felt that it didn't get. He wanted something added in there about tech companies, all right? Congress was able to override his veto, right? That was the only time but it's pretty tough to override a veto, and particularly in this day and age, where we have almost literally our kind of political situations literally divided and at times very contentiously. So it's really hard to kind of override a veto. All right? When we get into state governments, certain governors who are the executives of state government will have what they call line item vetoes, which basically if they get a bill and they don't like certain parts of it, they can veto it, and it will go back to their legislative branches. Here in the executive and the federal government, it's all or nothing. All right, but these are kind of put into the Constitution as a check on each other. And then the judicial branch here, like I said, was initially the weakest. Within the judicial branch, there's a court case that is going to kind of establish their kind of important check on both the legislative and executive. This case called Marbury versus Madison, which is often cited. I'm going to play this short little video. It's real short. All right, so like I said, this is how kind of the judicial branch has a check on both the executive and legislative actually came out of a court case in the early 1800s called Marbury versus Madison, which is a complicated case, and it says on government appointment and basically kind of people being appointed from a previous kind of administration here. Like I said, there was an act that was passed by Congress that actually gave the courts a little bit more power. The courts, though, in turn, kind of basically determined that went against the Constitution, establishing this concept that is really the basis of the kind of the check that the judicial branch has on both, called judicial review. All right, and so this is where the idea of where in laws that are passed or enforced, if they come in front of the Supreme Court, they're determined to be constitutional or unconstitutional. All right, and so in a sense, while it's a weird thing, the court is basically basically taking away some of its power that was initiated in the Judiciary Act. It actually decreased some of its power when it comes to checks and balances. All right, and judge, one of the powers of the executive branch is to appoint Supreme Court judges. All right, and that's a big thing, and that's where elections kind of have consequences here, and they have to be approved by the Senate, though. All right. And so they can, as a result of kind of our current kind of political climate here, they can be while judges are supposed to be unbiased. You guys know what bias means? What's a bias? When you hear someone's biased against something, usually you already have kind of your own opinion of it. Judges are supposed to they're supposed to be unbiased. They're supposed to look at cases at hand and not have their kind of political views kind of like influence their decisions. That's pretty hard to do. All right. People are people still. Right. So with this idea here, we start to see as time goes on, like courts, there's certain people, like both on the right and the left, that talk about how like judges can be like too politicized. All right. It's usually based on like what decision was made and who wins or loses, unfortunately. All right. So we'll talk about this in a little more detail when we get into chapter 7, which is on the judicial branch. All right. So on Monday, I'm going to send out just kind of like a worksheet on separation of powers. All right. Tuesday, you guys will be at home. You guys here. We're going to do this DBQ thing on how the Constitution is supposed to kind of protect against tyranny. All right. It's a long thing. It's about six documents. All right. That we're going to kind of analyze here. All right. I'm going to give you about a week though to get it done. All right. But we're going to do the first part together just to kind of get you guys. And it's going to require, and you guys, even though most of you guys will be at home here, it's going to require some like kind of participation. I know it's early in the morning, but I will ask you guys questions. It's okay to answer them, even if there's really, like I said, unless you say something really horribly awful, there's really no right or wrong answer. All right. I'm looking for like kind of you thinking a little bit, what I'm saying? Trying to get the brain going. All right. Sound good? Okay. We're done. You guys at home, have a good weekend. Does anybody need me to go back to any slides? I forgot to ask that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which one you need?
Just the last one.
This one right here?
No, the one before it.
Gotcha. That one?
Yep.
Yeah. Did you get it, Jordan?
Yeah.
Okay, good deal. All right. Have a good weekend.
You too.
All right.